In the tense early years of the Cold War in Asia, when the Chinese Civil War had ended not with reconciliation, but with geographic division, a cluster of small rocky islands off the coast of mainland China became the focal point of nuclear brinkmanship that exposed how unresolved civil conflicts could metastasize into global crises, because the Quemoy Matsu Crises, also known as the Taiwan Strait Crises, were not fundamentally about territory or military value, but about legitimacy, credibility, and the dangerous logic of deterrence applied to unfinished wars. And these crises emerged directly from the aftermath of 1949, when the Chinese Communist Party proclaimed the People's Republic of China on the mainland, while the defeated nationalist government retreated across the Taiwan Strait to the island of Taiwan, carrying with it the claim to represent all of China, a claim embodied by Chiang Kai-shek, whose regime survived not through victory, but through displacement, protected by geography and increasingly by American power, and for the new communist leadership in Beijing, led by Mao Zedong. This situation represented not a frozen status quo, but an unfinished revolution, because the existence of a rival Chinese state backed by the United States challenged the legitimacy of the People's Republic and symbolized the persistence of foreign interference in China's internal affairs, and the tiny offshore islands of Quemoy, Kinmen, and Matsu, located just miles from the Chinese mainland, yet controlled by the nationalists, became loaded symbols in this unresolved struggle. Because they physically embodied the proximity of rival regimes and the possibility that the Civil War might resume at any moment. And from a purely military perspective, these islands were exposed, difficult to defend, and of limited strategic value. Yet politically, they were invaluable, because abandoning them would signal weakness and acceptance of permanent division, while defending them risked escalation far beyond their intrinsic worth. And it was this asymmetry between symbolic value and material utility that made them so dangerous. And as the Cold War hardened in the early 1950s, the United States found itself drawn into this dilemma, because American policy toward China had evolved rapidly from wartime alliance to containment. And Taiwan became a critical node in the U.S. security architecture in Asia, not because of its intrinsic power, but because its survival demonstrated American resolve in the face of communist expansion. And this resolve was tested repeatedly as the People's Republic of China sought to apply pressure through limited military action, probing how far the United States would go to defend a regime it recognized only ambiguously. And the first major crisis erupted in the mid-1950s, when artillery bombardments and amphibious threats against nationalist-held islands forced Washington to confront a question it had long deferred: whether the defense of Taiwan extended to these offshore positions. And this question mattered profoundly, because any clear commitment risked drawing the United States into a direct confrontation with China, while any ambiguity risked undermining deterrence and encouraging further pressure. And within this context, American decision-making was shaped by the administration of Dwight D. Eisenhower, whose experience as a military commander made him acutely aware of the dangers of escalation, but also deeply invested in the credibility of American commitments. And the crisis unfolded against the backdrop of nuclear strategy that treated atomic weapons not as unthinkable instruments, but as usable tools of deterrence, a mindset that would shape how far leaders were willing to go over places few Americans could locate on a map. And as Chinese forces shelled Quemoy and Matsu intermittently, the Eisenhower administration responded by strengthening the defense of Taiwan, escorting nationalist supply convoys, and signaling that American power stood behind the island. Yet, it stopped short of making an explicit guarantee that the offshore islands would be defended at all costs, preserving ambiguity while increasing risk. And this calibrated response reflected a belief that controlled escalation could stabilize the situation, that firmness without clarity would deter Beijing without locking Washington into an automatic war, and for Mao and the Chinese leadership, the bombardment served multiple purposes, allowing them to test American reactions, assert sovereignty claims, and manage domestic expectations by demonstrating resolve against perceived encirclement, all without committing to a full-scale invasion that might provoke catastrophic retaliation. And this reciprocal probing created a dangerous rhythm where each side sought to signal strength without crossing an ill-defined line, and the islands became a stage on which both superpowers rehearsed the grammar of Cold War crisis management, using limited force to communicate political intent. And yet the inherent instability of this approach was evident because the margin for miscalculation was thin and the stakes were enormous. And within Washington, the crisis sparked intense debate over the role of nuclear weapons, because some officials argued that the credible threat of nuclear retaliation was the only way to deter Chinese aggression, while others warned that invoking nuclear war over small islands would erode moral authority and risk uncontrollable escalation. And this debate was not abstract, because contingency plans were drawn up that contemplated the use of atomic weapons against mainland targets if nationalist positions were overrun, revealing how close the Cold War came to nuclear conflict, not over Berlin or Korea, but over isolated islands whose primary importance lay in what they represented, rather than what they could deliver militarily. And as the crisis ebbed without decisive resolution, it established a pattern that would repeat because the underlying issues remained unresolved. Taiwan's status ambiguous, China's claim unyielding, and American commitments deliberately opaque, creating a structural tension that ensured future confrontations. And this pattern resurfaced dramatically in 1958, when renewed Chinese shelling of Quemoy escalated into the Second Taiwan Strait Crisis, again forcing Washington to decide how far it would go to uphold its credibility. And by this point, the stakes had increased, because China's alliance with the Soviet Union had begun to fray, altering the strategic context, and American nuclear superiority was no longer absolute, complicating assumptions about deterrence. And yet the logic of brinkmanship remained intact, because neither side could afford to appear weak in a confrontation that symbolized broader contests over legitimacy, alignment, and the post-war order in Asia. And throughout these crises, the people most exposed were the soldiers and civilians on the islands themselves, who endured relentless bombardment, supply shortages, and the constant possibility that their outposts might become the trigger for a war far beyond their control, illustrating how Cold War strategy often placed peripheral actors in positions of extreme vulnerability to serve symbolic ends. And in this sense, the Quemoy Matsu Crises revealed a central paradox of Cold War deterrence, that stability was sought through the willingness to risk annihilation over matters that were strategically marginal but politically charged. And as the artillery fell and diplomats maneuvered, the world came dangerously close to a conflict between nuclear-armed powers, not because of a grand design for war, but because of an unresolved civil conflict reframed through the absolutist logic of ideological rivalry. And it is within this convergence of local dispute and global strategy that the true significance of the Quemoy Matsu Crises must be understood, not as obscure episodes on the margins of history, but as moments when the Cold War's capacity to magnify small places into existential stakes was laid bare, exposing how easily symbolic geography could become the fulcrum on which the fate of nations, and potentially the world, might turn. As the first crisis subsided without open war, The unresolved tension around Quemoy and Matsu hardened into a structural fault line in East Asian Cold War politics, because neither side achieved what it ultimately wanted, and this incomplete outcome ensured that the islands would remain a recurring test of resolve rather than a settled question. And for the United States, the experience reinforced a preference for strategic ambiguity, a doctrine that sought to deter aggression without committing explicitly to every contingency. Yet this ambiguity came at a cost, because it transferred uncertainty downward to commanders and allies who were forced to operate under the constant risk that local clashes might escalate beyond control, and this risk became more pronounced as the late 1950s approached, when the second Taiwan Strait Crisis erupted under markedly different global conditions, because by 1958, the Cold War had entered a more complex phase in which the bipolar clarity of the early post-war years was beginning to fracture, and China's relationship with the Soviet Union was no longer one of unquestioned alignment, a shift that encouraged Mao to pursue independent demonstrations of resolve designed to assert China's revolutionary credentials and strategic autonomy. And the renewed shelling of Quemoy that began in August 1958 was not simply a reprise of earlier pressure, but a calculated escalation intended to send multiple signals at once to Taipei, to Washington, to Moscow, and to domestic audiences within China, demonstrating that the People's Republic would not be constrained by superpower diplomacy when core claims were at stake. And this multi-directional signaling made the crisis especially dangerous because it introduced overlapping audiences with different expectations, increasing the risk that restraint by one party might be misinterpreted as weakness by another. And on the American side, the Eisenhower administration confronted a dilemma sharpened by the growth of China's conventional capabilities and the limits of nuclear threats, because while atomic weapons still formed the backbone of deterrence, their use against mainland China now carried greater risks of international backlash and escalation, particularly given the uncertain response of the Soviet Union. And this uncertainty forced Washington to rely more heavily on conventional measures, including naval escorts, logistical support, and the provision of advanced weaponry to nationalist forces, blurring the line between advisory support and direct involvement. And as American naval vessels escorted supply convoys to the besieged islands, the proximity of U.S. and Chinese forces increased the possibility of accidental confrontation, creating a scenario in which a misfired shell or misread maneuver could have triggered rapid escalation. And this proximity highlighted how Cold War crises often unfolded not through deliberate decisions to go to war, but through cumulative risk generated by efforts to avoid it, as each side took steps to strengthen its position while hoping the other would ultimately back down. And for the nationalist government in Taiwan, the crisis reinforced a precarious dependence, because Chiang Kai-shek viewed the defense of Quemoy and Matsu as essential to maintaining the claim that his regime remained the legitimate government of all China. Yet his insistence on holding the islands constrained American options, tying U.S. credibility to positions that Washington privately recognized as militarily tenuous. And this divergence of interests underscored a recurring Cold War problem, that alliances formed under pressure often bound major powers to the symbolic priorities of smaller partners, increasing the risk of entrapment. And as the shelling continued in a pattern that alternated between intense bombardment and deliberate pauses, the crisis took on an almost ritualized character, with each side probing limits without crossing them, revealing an emerging grammar of restraint in which violence was used as communication rather than as a prelude to conquest. And yet this grammar depended on mutual understanding that was never guaranteed because it rested on assumptions about rationality, control, and shared interest in avoiding catastrophe. Assumptions that could not be verified and might collapse under stress, and as diplomatic channels worked quietly to diffuse the situation, the world once again stepped back from the brink, not because the underlying dispute was resolved, but because all parties judged that the costs of escalation outweighed the benefits of immediate victory, leaving Quemoy and Matsu in nationalist hands and the Taiwan Strait suspended in a state of armed non-resolution. And this suspension mattered because it institutionalized crisis as a condition rather than an event, embedding the possibility of war into the regional order and ensuring that nuclear brinkmanship would remain a latent feature of U.S.-China relations. And in this sense, the second crisis did not mark an end, but a consolidation, transforming the islands from flashpoints into permanent symbols of unresolved legitimacy, where each shell fired or withheld carried meaning beyond its physical impact, and where the Cold War's capacity to magnify local disputes into global dangers was reinforced rather than diminished, setting a precedent for how unresolved civil wars could be internationalized indefinitely through deterrence and ambiguity. As the dust settled after the second crisis, the Quemoy-Matsu standoff entered a prolonged phase of managed instability that revealed how Cold War deterrence could normalize permanent tension without resolving its causes, because the absence of decisive war was not the product of reconciliation, but of mutual exhaustion and calculated restraint, leaving all parties trapped within positions they could neither abandon nor fully enforce. And this outcome hardened the Taiwan Strait into one of the most enduring fault lines of the Cold War, where the threat of escalation became a background condition rather than an episodic danger. And for the United States, the experience reinforced the logic of extended deterrence in Asia, confirming that credibility depended not only on treaty commitments, but on the willingness to absorb risk in ambiguous situations, even when the strategic value of the contested territory was minimal, and this willingness was institutionalized through continued military presence and planning that treated the defense of Taiwan, and by extension its offshore islands, as integral to regional stability, a posture that carried long-term consequences for U.S.-China relations because it embedded confrontation into routine operations, making each naval patrol and supply mission a potential signal of resolve. And on the Chinese side, the crises validated a strategy of calibrated pressure, demonstrating that limited force could be used to assert claims and test opponents without provoking full-scale war, a lesson that would inform Beijing's approach to peripheral disputes for decades, because it showed that restraint did not require passivity, and that escalation could be managed through rhythm and symbolism, as seen in the alternating bombardment schedules that transformed shelling into a political message rather than a purely military act. And this ritualization of violence underscored how the Cold War increasingly functioned through performative confrontation, where actions were designed as much for their communicative value as for their physical effect. And for the populations living on Quemoy and Matsu, this meant enduring a peculiar form of existence, where daily life unfolded under the constant possibility of renewed bombardment. Supply lines were militarized, and civilian infrastructure was subordinated to defense, illustrating how Cold War strategy imposed prolonged insecurity on communities whose fate was tied to symbolic geography rather than local choice. And this insecurity extended to Taiwan itself, where the crises reinforced authoritarian controls justified by external threat, shaping domestic politics through the logic of siege and delaying liberalization by framing dissent as vulnerability. And internationally, the Quemoy-Matsu episodes contributed to a broader understanding that nuclear weapons had altered the grammar of war without eliminating it, because the crises demonstrated that confrontation could be sustained below the threshold of nuclear exchange. Yet this sustainability depended on constant vigilance and the suppression of miscalculation, creating a system that was stable only so long as all actors continued to behave rationally under pressure, an assumption that could never be guaranteed. And as the Cold War progressed, the Taiwan Strait remained a space where this assumption was tested repeatedly, even as formal crises receded, because the underlying questions of sovereignty and legitimacy were never resolved, merely contained. And this containment was itself a product of nuclear brinkmanship, which discouraged decisive action while magnifying the symbolic stakes of every move, and in this sense, the Quemoy Matsu Crises revealed how nuclear weapons did not freeze history, but reshaped it into a series of suspended conflicts, where wars were neither concluded nor abandoned, but held in a precarious balance through deterrence and ambiguity. And this balance, while avoiding catastrophe, imposed its own costs, entrenching divisions and normalizing the perpetual risk of escalation, a condition that would persist long after the artillery fell silent and that continues to shape perceptions of the Taiwan Strait as a place where small territories can still carry the weight of global consequences. As the Cold War matured into a system of long-term rivalry rather than episodic confrontation, the Quemoy Matsu Crises came to be understood less as isolated emergencies and more as early demonstrations of how unresolved sovereignty disputes could be indefinitely stabilized through the threat of overwhelming force, because the crises showed that nuclear-armed powers could tolerate ongoing, localized violence so long as it remained bounded and legible within shared expectations of restraint. And this realization reshaped strategic thinking on both sides of the Pacific, encouraging a view of the Taiwan Strait not as a problem to be solved, but as a condition to be managed. And this management relied heavily on deterrence signaling, alliance credibility, and the careful calibration of ambiguity, particularly on the American side, where policymakers concluded that absolute clarity would either provoke war or invite abandonment, leaving ambiguity as the least dangerous option despite its inherent risks. And this choice embedded the United States permanently into the cross-strait equation, transforming what began as a Chinese civil conflict into a durable feature of global Cold War structure. While for China, the crises reinforced the belief that time and pressure favored eventual reunification, allowing Beijing to defer decisive action while continuing to assert claims through controlled military posture and political rhetoric. A strategy that avoided catastrophic escalation while preserving revolutionary legitimacy. And this mutual accommodation of unresolved conflict had profound implications, because it normalized the idea that nuclear brinkmanship could coexist with routine governance, allowing societies and institutions to adapt to the presence of existential risk as background noise rather than acute emergency. And for Taiwan, this adaptation meant decades of militarization and political repression justified by perpetual threat, shaping identity and state formation under the assumption that survival depended on vigilance and external protection. While for the offshore islands themselves, it meant becoming permanent military outposts, their civilian character subsumed by fortifications and symbolism. And internationally, the Quemoy Matsu episodes contributed to a broader Cold War lesson, that credibility could be established through restraint as much as through action, because the willingness not to escalate in defense of marginal territory demonstrated rational control, even as it preserved deterrence. A lesson that would influence later crisis management in places like Berlin and beyond. Yet this lesson came with a hidden cost, because it entrenched divisions that might otherwise have been resolved through negotiation, freezing political conflicts into geopolitical fixtures whose persistence generated recurring risk. And in this sense, the Quemoy Matsu Crises exemplify how the Cold War produced stability through suspension rather than settlement, maintaining peace by holding conflicts in place rather than addressing their root causes. And this approach, while effective in preventing immediate catastrophe, ensured that the Taiwan Strait would remain a latent flashpoint long after the specific crises faded, carrying forward the unresolved legacies of civil war, ideological rivalry, and nuclear deterrence into a future where small islands could still serve as the tripwires of great power confrontation, reminding the world that in the Cold War's architecture, geography mattered less for what it could yield than for what it could symbolize, and that even the most marginal territories could become anchors of global risk when history was left deliberately unfinished. As the decades passed, the Quemoy Matsu Crises increasingly revealed themselves as formative episodes that shaped not only the immediate trajectory of U.S.-China relations, but the broader Cold War understanding of how limited wars could be contained within nuclear boundaries, because they demonstrated that deterrence was not a static condition, but an ongoing process of negotiation conducted through posture, signaling, and restraint. And this process required constant recalibration as capabilities, alliances, and domestic politics evolved, ensuring that the Taiwan Strait remained a space of continuous strategic attention, even when overt crisis subsided. And for American planners, the lessons drawn from these confrontations reinforce the belief that forward defense, even of marginal positions, could anchor regional stability by deterring revisionist moves, a belief that justified long-term commitments whose original rationale was rooted in credibility rather than geography. While for Chinese leaders, the crises underscored the value of patience, showing that sustained pressure and symbolic assertion could preserve claims without incurring the catastrophic costs of full-scale war. And this asymmetry of objectives allowed both sides to coexist uneasily, each interpreting the absence of escalation as confirmation of their own strategic wisdom. And this coexistence mattered because it transformed the Taiwan Strait into a permanent theater of signaling, where military exercises, diplomatic statements, and alliance maneuvers carried meanings shaped by the memory of earlier brinkmanship, embedding historical precedent into contemporary decision-making. And for the inhabitants of Quemoy and Matsu, this meant living within a militarized normalcy, where fortifications and drills became part of everyday life, and the island's identity was inseparable from their role as symbols of resistance and vulnerability, illustrating how Cold War strategy often imposed enduring psychological and social costs on peripheral communities. And internationally, the crises contributed to a gradual recognition that nuclear weapons had imposed a ceiling on violence without eliminating competition, encouraging a form of conflict management that accepted ongoing tension as preferable to decisive resolution. And this acceptance influenced how later disputes were handled, favoring containment and signaling over settlement, a preference that reduced immediate risk while entrenching long-term instability. And from a historical perspective, the Quemoy Matsu Crises thus occupy a critical place in Cold War history, not because they resulted in territorial change or formal agreements, but because they clarified how nuclear brinkmanship could be sustained over time, turning unresolved conflicts into durable fixtures of the international system. And this durability carried its own dangers, because it normalized the presence of existential risk and relied on the continuous exercise of restraint under pressure, a requirement that could fail under conditions of misperception or domestic upheaval. And as the Cold War progressed, these risks were managed rather than resolved, leaving behind a legacy in which the Taiwan Strait remained a symbol of unfinished history, its small islands standing as reminders that global peace during the Cold War was often maintained not through reconciliation, but through the careful, perpetual balancing of threats over places whose value lay less in what they contained than in what they represented, a balancing act that kept war at bay while ensuring that its possibility was never fully removed from the horizon. As the Cold War entered its later decades, the significance of the Quemoy Matsu Crises became clearer, not in their immediate outcomes, but in how they redefined the acceptable boundaries of confrontation between nuclear-armed powers, because they demonstrated that the risk of nuclear war could be invoked implicitly, even casually, in disputes over marginal territory, normalizing a level of existential danger that would have been unthinkable only years earlier. And this normalization mattered because it shaped how future leaders assessed risk, teaching them that credibility could hinge on willingness to defend symbols rather than strategic assets. A lesson that embedded nuclear deterrence into everyday diplomacy rather than reserving it for absolute emergencies. And within this framework, the Taiwan Strait emerged as a permanent proving ground for resolve, where military readiness, alliance commitments, and political messaging were continuously tested against one another, ensuring that the memory of the crises influenced decision-making long after the artillery ceased. And for the United States, this legacy reinforced a long-term posture of engagement in East Asia, anchoring alliances and deployments justified not only by immediate threats, but by the need to prevent a perceived unraveling of credibility that might cascade across the region. While for China, the crises reinforced the conviction that sovereignty claims could be advanced incrementally without provoking catastrophic response, a strategy that relied on patience and the assumption that time favored reunification. And this divergence of perspectives allowed both sides to claim success while leaving the underlying dispute unresolved, locking the region into a condition of managed rivalry that persisted beyond the Cold War's formal end. And for Taiwan, the crises left a profound imprint on political culture, reinforcing authoritarian governance and a siege mentality that shaped identity and policy for decades, even as economic growth and international integration gradually altered the island's global position. And for the residents of Quemoy and Matsu, the legacy was lived daily, as their islands became enduring symbols of resistance and vulnerability, their civilian lives inseparable from fortifications and contingency planning, illustrating how Cold War strategy often imposed long-term human costs on communities chosen not for their agency, but for their symbolic value. And internationally, the crises contributed to a broader acceptance that unresolved conflicts could be stabilized indefinitely through deterrence, a belief that prioritized avoidance of catastrophe over pursuit of resolution. And this belief shaped global Cold War order by encouraging the freezing of disputes rather than their settlement, reducing immediate risk while entrenching divisions that would resurface under new conditions. And from a historical perspective, the Quemoy Matsu Crises thus reveal how the Cold War transformed local geography into global stakes, showing that even the smallest territories could become anchors of nuclear strategy when legitimacy, alliance credibility, and ideological rivalry converged. And as the 20th century progressed, this lesson remained embedded in international practice, reminding policymakers that peace in the Cold War era was often maintained not by resolving conflicts, but by sustaining them at a controlled boil, a strategy that depended on continuous restraint and carried the ever-present risk that miscalculation over a place few could find on a map might ignite consequences far beyond its shores. As historians later reassess the Cold War's most dangerous moments, the Quemoy Matsu Crises emerged as stark reminders that nuclear brinkmanship did not require grand capitals or vast armies to become lethal. Only unresolved legitimacy, rigid alliances, and leaders willing to gamble credibility on symbols, because the crises demonstrated that the Cold War's most volatile pressures often accumulated at the margins, where civil wars froze into international standoffs, and small territories became proxies for much larger questions about power and recognition. And this marginality mattered because it lowered the threshold at which existential risk could be introduced into decision-making, allowing nuclear weapons to hover in the background of disputes that would otherwise have been settled through conventional means or negotiation. And for the United States, the crises left a lasting imprint on strategic culture, reinforcing the belief that retreat, even from militarily indefensible positions, could trigger cascading doubt about alliance reliability across the globe, a belief that hardened commitment reflexes and made disengagement politically costly. While for China, the episodes confirmed that direct confrontation with a nuclear-armed superpower could be avoided without relinquishing claims, encouraging a long-term strategy that combined patience with periodic demonstrations of resolve. And this asymmetry allowed both sides to coexist within a shared understanding that war was unacceptable, yet pressure was necessary, creating a paradoxical stability rooted in mutual risk tolerance rather than trust. And for Taiwan, the legacy was deeply ambivalent, because while the defense of Quemoy and Matsu reinforced the island's survival and international relevance, it also entrenched authoritarian rule and delayed political liberalization by framing internal dissent as an existential threat during moments when external danger was acute, illustrating how external crises can reshape domestic trajectories. And at the human level, the crises imposed enduring psychological costs on those living closest to the fault line. As generations grew up under the shadow of artillery and evacuation plans, their everyday lives shaped by decisions made in distant capitals where the islands were discussed as abstractions rather than homes. And internationally, the Quemoy Matsu episodes fed into a broader Cold War lesson that deterrence worked not by eliminating conflict, but by structuring it, allowing confrontation to persist in limited, ritualized forms that communicated intent without crossing into catastrophe, a lesson that would inform later crisis management, even as it carried inherent fragility, because it depended on leaders' continued ability to interpret signals correctly and resist domestic pressures to escalate. And as the Cold War ended without resolving the Taiwan question, the islands remained where they had always been, physically unchanged, yet historically burdened. Their continued militarization, a testament to how conflicts can outlast the systems that created them. And in this sense, the Quemoy Matsu Crises occupy a critical place in Cold War history, revealing how nuclear weapons transformed not only the scale, but the geography of danger, making even the smallest islands potential flashpoints for world-ending decisions, and demonstrating that during the Cold War, peace was often preserved not by solving disputes, but by living indefinitely with their most dangerous implications. As the Cold War moved toward its conclusion, the Quemoy Matsu Crises stood as enduring evidence that the most consequential confrontations of the era were not always those that erupted into open war, but those that settled into long-term standoffs, where the risk of catastrophe was normalized and managed rather than eliminated, because the islands remained in nationalist hands not due to decisive victory, but because all major actors learned to live with an unresolved conflict whose costs were deemed preferable to the unknown consequences of resolution. And this acceptance mattered because it revealed how nuclear deterrence reshaped political imagination, narrowing the range of acceptable outcomes until suspension itself became stability. And for the United States, this meant maintaining a posture that upheld credibility without forcing final decisions, embedding ambiguity into policy as a permanent feature rather than a temporary expedient. While for China, it meant deferring reunification by force in favor of long-term pressure and symbolic assertion, a strategy that preserved claims while avoiding catastrophic escalation. And this mutual accommodation locked the Taiwan Strait into a pattern of managed rivalry that persisted beyond the ideological collapse of the Soviet bloc, demonstrating that Cold War conflicts could survive the Cold War itself. And for Taiwan, the legacy was complex, because the crises helped secure survival under American protection, while simultaneously reinforcing a sense of siege that shaped governance, identity, and foreign policy for decades. Delaying liberalization and embedding security concerns at the core of political life. And for the residents of Quemoy and Matsu, the end of crisis did not mean demilitarization, but normalization of threat, as bunkers, drills, and restrictions became permanent features of existence, illustrating how Cold War strategy imposed long-term burdens on communities selected for their symbolic value rather than their agency. And internationally, the crises influenced broader thinking about brinkmanship, reinforcing the belief that nuclear weapons could be used implicitly as instruments of political signaling without triggering war, a belief that encouraged future leaders to tolerate high levels of risk in pursuit of credibility, even as it relied on assumptions about rational behavior that could never be guaranteed. And from a historical perspective, this legacy underscores why the Quemoy-Matsu crises matter far beyond their immediate context, because they demonstrate how the Cold War transformed geography into ideology, turning small islands into vessels for global anxiety, and making unresolved civil wars permanent fixtures of international politics. And as the world moved into a post-Cold War era still shaped by these unresolved legacies, the crises remained a reminder that peace achieved through deterrence is often indistinguishable from suspended conflict, stable only so long as restraint holds, and vulnerable always to the possibility that a place few can find on a map might once again become the fulcrum on which far greater forces collide. In closing, the Quemoy-Matsu crises stand as some of the clearest demonstrations of how the Cold War transformed unresolved civil conflicts into permanent sites of global danger, because they revealed that nuclear brinkmanship did not require vast armies, ideological crusades, or territorial conquest, only credibility, symbolism, and the willingness of great powers to risk catastrophe over places whose material value was negligible, but whose political meaning was absolute. And what made these crises so perilous was precisely this imbalance. The fact that tiny islands only miles from the Chinese mainland became tripwires for a potential US-China war, not because they altered the strategic balance, but because abandoning them would have signaled weakness in a world where perception often mattered more than power. And this logic exposed the deepest vulnerability of Cold War deterrence, that it encouraged leaders to defend symbols as if they were interests, binding nuclear threats to disputes that could not be cleanly resolved. And, for the United States, the crises entrenched a doctrine of strategic ambiguity that preserved peace by postponing decisions, while for China, they reinforced a long-term approach of pressure without final escalation. And for Taiwan, they embedded survival within a framework of perpetual insecurity, shaping political development through fear and militarization. And taken together, these outcomes illustrate how the Cold War produced stability, not by settling conflicts, but by freezing them, holding history in suspension through the constant management of risk. And the people who lived on Quemoy and Matsu bore the cost of that suspension, their daily lives constrained by fortifications and contingency plans that reflected decisions made far away. And as the Cold War ended without resolving the Taiwan question, the islands remained where they had always been, physical reminders that some of the era's most dangerous confrontations ended not with treaties or victories, but with silence and endurance. And in this sense, the Quemoy-Matsu Crises matter not because war occurred, but because it did not, because they show how close the world came to nuclear conflict over territory few could identify, and how easily the Cold War's logic could elevate marginal geography into existential stakes, revealing a system in which peace was maintained not through trust or reconciliation, but through the perpetual, precarious balance of threats that could collapse at any moment if restraint failed.